I was born and raised in Shreveport, a mid-sized city in the northwest corner of the state of Louisiana. All my life, I've witnessed as the situation for Black people in America has deteriorated. Unemployment, crime, drugs, lack of housing, and everyone has their own ideas as to why this is. But after decades of research, I can report to you confidently that it has nothing to do with your level of education. It has nothing to do with social policy. It has nothing to do with the media or your lack of proper religion. Every major problem Black people have in America can be directly traced back to our lack of money. And this is the plague of our people. There's just one question that matters more than any other for Black people, and I undertook this documentary because I've been driven my entire life to find the answer to one question. Why are we the poorest people in the United States? My journey to find answers to this question took me across the country to speak to the most relevant minds on this subject. I started out with one set of beliefs, but I returned home with a whole new set of facts. We are the poorest people in America because we shop and work at other people's businesses, but we don't own any of our own. Businesses are where all money and wealth come from. There is no path to wealth for the employee, only for the employer. After completing this journey, I'm now more convinced than ever that the answer to fixing our problem begins every morning with everything we do after 7 a.m. We live in a world that runs on money. It controls everything around you and determines your ability to even survive. The key to financial wealth isn't just having a job. The keys to wealth are the businesses you own and the assets you control. Black people haven't made any progress in the assets we own and control since we were on the plantations, and as a result, we are the most impoverished people on earth.
We're exactly where we were in 1860, on the eve of the Civil War. At that particular time, you had about 187,000 blacks who were supposedly free out of almost 5 million. Those 187,000 blacks had successfully accumulated about 1/2 or 1% of the nation's wealth. And here we are 147 years later, we still own and control about 1/2 or 1% of the nation's wealth, of the richest nation on earth. And even in comparative terms, that is the same thing is true with blacks internationally, where black folk internationally make up about 25% of the world's population. And out of over $300 trillion worth of wealth, black folk own and control less than 1/2 or 1% of the world's wealth. And it's not social integration, not civil rights that determines your opportunities, your equal opportunities, or your competitiveness. It's what you own and control in terms of vital resources. That's what determines what you're going to get in this world.
I almost ran for mayor of Washington, D.C. in 2010. And part of what inspired me to consider running was I looked at some statistics on poverty in America. And I found that Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, majority African American city, had the second highest poverty rate in America. Okay, now the highest poverty rate was Mississippi. Now at the same hand, it had the lowest unemployment rate in the country. So you said, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. So I looked, and I realized that 21% of all Washington, D.C. residents lived in poverty. 45% of every African American child in that city was growing up in poverty. Almost 40% of every African American citizen in that city was living in poverty. So you look at those statistics and you say, what in the world is going on here? Lack of economic opportunity. So we're where we are today because we have the entrepreneurial spirit has been taken away from us.
Even as we look at, we have this African American president, and people would like to think that we have arrived. We have not. because we still fall on the shorter end of things when you talk about education, you talk about economic development, business opportunities, business growth, small business development. All of those things the African American community still is not seeing the full fruition of.
When you don't own businesses, your people are poor, and the cost of poverty impacts every other avenue of life.
We study this in psychology. Crime is a function of education and employment. Whenever you look at crime, you look at the educational index, you look at the employment index. Right now in America, half of the African American men in Philadelphia is unemployed. Half the African American men in Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, New York City. When you look at most of the major cities, our men are unemployed. You cannot keep the unemployment rate out of the discussion of crime.
One thing that I told my sons, and I raised them in urban communities that weren't the best, no excuses. Nobody cares that you don't have a father. Nobody cares that you're being raised by a single teenage mom. Nobody cares about that. You need to go to school and do what you have to do, because what they have for you and your excuses are graves and jail cells.
And why do we need our people to be self-sufficient? Because when you're not self-sufficient, you can't speak your mind. One of the biggest reasons why black people have been so cowardly in the post-civil rights movement, not standing up for ourselves, standing up for our children, standing up against police brutality, we're scared to lose our jobs. We have to work. We got kids. I can't talk about the racism on my job. I might lose it. So the reason why we're not speaking our mind is because we don't have economic freedom.
Wealth is defined as intergenerational. If you can't pass it on, then it's not wealth. Building wealth is already difficult, but it's practically impossible when your parents didn't leave anything for you to build it with. When most non-black people die, they pass on assets to their children. But when black people die, they only pass on poverty.
If you don't have any wealth, what are you passing on? Look, see, we've spent most of our lives focusing politically on things that are non-inheritable. See, when the civil rights movement started, what did your generation focus on? You focused on welfare, food stamps, public housing, okay, civil rights, social integration, preferential treatment, getting a job. How do you inherit those things? What is there to inherit? And Nick said, well, we got civil rights. You got a civil rights right now to go down to a hotel, to the richest hotel, and go get the most expensive room and have lobster fed to you every day. But if you don't have the money, you cannot do it.
And as you know, an African-American teenager has the most difficult job in America of anyone in finding employment. The businesses of America would rather hire a child who doesn't even speak English before they hire an African-American youth, because of the negative stereotypes and stigmatisms that even we as African-American have put forth about our own children.
Let's look at the numbers. Black people are 13% of the American population, yet we own 1/3 of 1% of the world's wealth. This number is projected to grow only slightly, even for the next decade. The annual census report in 2012 states that the average white person's income was $30,114. The average black person's income was $18,648, nearly half what the average white person makes. As bad as the personal income situation is, the picture gets even more grim when we analyze wealth. According to an Insight Center for Community Economic Development study, the median wealth for white men in America is $43,800, but the median wealth for black men is $7,900, and the median wealth for black women is only $100. A Pew Research report in 2011 also reported on the black wealth gap in America based on, at the time, newly released government data, which showed that in 2005, the net worth of black households was at $12,124. This had collapsed by 2009 to $5,677, a fall of 53% in only 4 years. The report found that a major reason blacks lag behind whites so much when it comes to wealth is because 24% of black people don't have assets of any kind other than a car.
See, one of our biggest problems as a people is we tend to confuse wealth with money, cash with capital. The only thing you can do with money is give it away. Our black athletes and our rappers, you know what they do? They spend most of their money on what? Things that depreciate with value. Cars and clothes and chains. 10 years from now, that car isn't worth anything. 10 years from now, that clothes you bought isn't worth anything. You look at other folks, what do they spend their money on? Land and property, international business. They invest in resources. So even when their cash disappears, guess what? They still have millions of dollars of income, okay, or millions of dollars of residual unearned income in their investments, which is why I argue that there's no such thing as a black middle class. That does not exist. Class relates to ownership of wealth. Class is ownership of wealth.
While these mainstream organizations are great places to be and can be great places to be and are viable entities, you know, it's about ownership of assets. And that's really the issue. That's an area where I think that whether we're talking media, whether we're talking sports, whether we're talking almost any music, almost anything that we as African Americans are involved in, we fall very short when it comes to an understanding ownership of assets. And that's where real wealth is created. And that's where real power is created.
I've spent my entire adult life studying this, and I can tell you the primary reason black people are poor and have no assets is our lack of businesses. Businesses are crucial because businesses are where all capital originates. Business is the source that all governments and citizens get their money from. According to the 2010 census, there were 1.9 million black businesses in the U.S. Most had sprung up over the course of a few years. This may sound impressive, but that changes when you realize that the failure rate for black businesses can be well over 60%. This means that out of a population of about 40 million people, our business ownership rate hovers at around 2% or less. And this shortage of black businesses makes us the single largest consumer class in America. We buy everything, but we own nothing.
Don't confuse consumer power as being a power. You should be asking just a question. What can you produce? It's what you can produce that makes it determine whether or not you're successful, not what you can buy. What can you produce? You live in a society that's based on production. That's what determines your value. What do you produce? We live in a society where black folk are zero producers. Zero producers and 100% consumers. And consumerism comes from the word to consume. To consume means to be eaten up or wasted away. Consuming is a death knell. And when a black person were to tell me that, so look, I can go buy cell phones and Mercedes and put big $500 rims on a van. That's not a positive to me, that's a negative.
Because of desegregation, black people felt we no longer needed to provide our own goods and services because now white society would be obligated to give us theirs. The flip side of this delusion was that we no longer needed to provide our own jobs because now white society would be obligated to give us theirs. And this misconception has been the biggest reason that black unemployment has remained stubbornly high.
Economics is largely controlled along ethnic lines. If you look at Asian American businesses, if you look at Hispanic American businesses, if you look at European American business, East Indian American businesses, Arab American businesses, they are largely family-based, and when they have to go out and hire other people, they try to keep it within the ethnic group that they belong to. Everyone protects their business by their ethnicity, so their identity becomes a weapon of economic protection and success.
This has a lot to do with the reason I'm here. And that is not only have I worked at these places, whether it's Bloomberg or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but I also spent many years covering the industry. I look at these companies, and the reason I started off talking about covering these companies, almost always, I look at the boards of all these companies, right? I always do. I look at the senior management at all these companies. I can tell you right now, go online and look at the mainstream media companies, that most of them have pictures of their senior management. Just take a look and then compare what that senior management looks like to what the consumer base looks like. It's starkly different.
One of the most commonly cited examples of Black economic power is the Black Wall Street. While most people talk about the Black Wall Street of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the reality is that there were several locations around the country at this time that were designated as a Black Wall Street. But the shame of the Black Wall Street is that Black people were willing to march and protest and die to integrate, but we weren't willing to do the same thing to rebuild all the Black Wall Streets around America. Instead, we focused on jobs. But the problem with simply having a job is that a job is not an asset. A job is simply the bottom rung of the economic ladder. Since the cotton fields, Black people have been primarily concerned with finding work, all the while refusing to accept that no one ever got rich working for a living. In order to understand how we get out of this, you first have to understand how we got into this, and most importantly, why we were made into the poorest people in America. It begins with the European worldwide expansion that was the driving force behind the slave trade, which claimed the lives of countless millions of Africans. While the world rightfully focuses on the cost in misery, suffering, and death in regard to slavery, the world, and Black people in particular, have lost sight of the fact that slavery was primarily an economic strategy intended to enrich a few nations at the expense of African peoples. The social damage of slavery was tremendous, but it's the economic legacy of slavery that haunts us to this very day.
Economically, the worst part of it was that, as I said, it generated a new form of business operations in the world. Prior to slavery, the operating intersection, the interaction of capital and money in the world and business transaction was called mercantilism. Let's go back to 1441 when Henry the Navigator went around the coast of Africa and picked up about 16 blacks and brought them back and gave them to the Pope in Italy. And the Pope began to use these blacks as slaves and used them very, very successfully and used them as a labor class. And then Pope Innocent came out and says, hey, this is a good thing. So after Columbus discovered America, they said, everybody started getting blacks and use them as slaves. And so then they started going out to Africa and to explore the opportunities to use blacks as slaves. So in the 1500s, all of Europe was being devastated. Europe was a devastated continent. It was racked with poverty, criminal behavior, famine, starvation, and everything else. It was a decimated continent. And so in the 1500s, they started going after Columbus supposedly discovered America, started going to Africa and picking up all these slaves based on what Pope Innocent had said. And they started paying about $25 a piece for each one of them they picked up. And they used a new system from the capitalism that formed, that overruled, that's replaced mercantilism and says, now if I pay $25 for something, I'm gonna have to get an appreciated profit off it, like 1,500%. And they started taking those blacks and selling them around the world for an actual about $300 or $400 a piece. And so what that did is that our race started, RACE started, where all these major countries around the world started in Europe, starting first, started capitalizing and building money and wealth off of black folk, off their labor and their resources they was extracting out of Africa. Now, while they were doing all that, everybody was getting rich, and black labor was enriching everybody on earth. Black people were making every continent on the earth rich. That was about 9 European nations. Also, the Asians were also enslaving black folk. And we got into this country, American Indians started enslaving black folk. Everybody's gotten rich off of black folk. And this race went on up until about 1859. But during that course, every continent got rich in building the Western world, Latin America, South America, North America. Everybody got rich and began to acquire almost 99% of all the resources and all the wealth, except black folk. Black folk were in a ditch. And in 1859, by 1860, when the Civil War started, they said the race was over, the contest was over. And let nothing change now. All the dominant societies control and own all the resources, money, and wealth. Blacks who were in the ditch own nothing.
If we look back historically, we go back 100 years, 200 years, you look at the level of oppression that we endured, that our ancestors endured, and the barriers that were imposed even after slavery, the barriers that were imposed upon us in terms of access to opportunity, access to education, access to equal housing, access to a place to live, access to accommodations. And so those barriers imposed several long-term impacts on us. Lack of long-term perpetual opportunity, so that put us in the spiral of perpetual economic turmoil.
The problem at the end of slavery, despite African Americans having skills that they could have used to build an independent reality, they still needed access to resources in order to be able to do that. So I may have been a carpenter, I may have been a printer, I may have been a bricklayer, I may have been a mason, but guess what? If I don't have access to resources for me to start my own business, then it's going to be difficult for me to do so.
Slavery and its successor, the Jim Crow era, and all its subsequent laws forced black people into a state of abject poverty and kept them there. It stole wealth in the form of labor and resources from black people and gave it to white men. This unfair economic advantage created the world's richest nation, who constructed a system of white male privilege designed to give white men permanent generational wealth and access to capital, while making sure black people were permanently poor and destitute. This was the purpose and reason for slavery. As long as we don't own businesses, then we don't control the earth's resources. And as long as blacks don't control any resources, then white privilege is maintained. Black people are eternal victims of racism, but we fail to break its grip on us because we don't understand what it is, what it does, and why it was brought into existence.
Race is a contest, just like in a bicycle race, automobile race. Race is a contest where people are competing. Groups is a group concept. People are competing to get from here to there. Whoever gets there first, the most wins.
You got to look at this as the Indianapolis 500. Now, imagine, somebody starting a race on lap 300 and somebody else starting the race on lap 50. It would take a Herculean effort for that person starting off at 50. They'd have to also have the other person in front who's at lap 300 have a flat tire, have some other car problems and so forth to catch that person. And still, that person has such a big lead, it's almost impossible to catch unless that person gets out of a race. And that person's not going to get out of the race. So the challenge that we have to have is that, okay, now we're all driving cars that are similar speed, but still, if you're getting a better education and you're getting, better access to capital and so forth, and you're driving a better car. And so even if there's no roadblocks, you're driving a better car.
When the race was over then, they took the E off of race and stuck ISM, which meant racism, which means maintain the status quo. A suffix stuck on the end of race is maintain the status quo. Blacks got nothing, everybody else got something. And so consequently, when racism then became a definition of saying don't let anything move from the hands of those who got all the power and the wealth and resources over a 300-year period, let none of that move into the hands of black folk. And the dominant society said, therefore, we're going to be against affirmative action, preferential treatment, set-asides, anything that would move wealth and resources into the hands of black folk. That's what racism is. Racism is a competitive relationship between groups of people who are competing for the ownership and control of resources. It has nothing to do with, has absolutely nothing to do with prejudice, has nothing to do with discrimination, has nothing to do with bias. But somehow our leaders, as a result of that, have been misled in believing that those terms are synonymous, and people get away with using them. They somehow pretend that racism is no different from prejudice, bigotry, and hatred, and they're all the same. They're not. And see, racism was an economic issue. It's always been an economic issue. It's not a social issue. It's not a political issue. It's an economic issue. And until black folk come to understand that, they'll always be at the bottom of the barrel. That's the one thing they never learned, and that's what's been keeping us at the bottom of the barrel. We don't understand the nature of racism. We don't understand the nature of how all the resources got maldistributed.
If you want to see what black economic empowerment is capable of, according to the fedpartnership.gov website, between the years 1888 and 1934, 134 black banks were created in the United States. And from 1867 through 1917, the number of black businesses increased from 4,000 to 50,000. As of the third quarter of 2014, there were only 25 black-owned banks still operating in the United States. In comparison, there are 30 Hispanic-owned banks and almost 80 Asian-owned banks. According to Forbes magazine, there are over 1,600 billionaires on Earth today, but only 9 of those people are black. This despite our being 25% of the world's population. Black people have always known that white privilege was a problem, and so black people turned to political action to level the playing field. But political action has failed to be a solution. This is because, like racism, black people do not understand what politics is, and like racism, politics is about wealth.
You have the mayor, you have your city council people, you have your state representatives. You have these individuals who really do want to make an impact. It's just, what do you address first? So do you lay off the firefighters, or do you lay off the police force? Do you close the schools, or do you keep the schools open and continue to have them underperform and hope for the best? Because either we lay off, we close schools, or we close down the whole school district. What do you do? Who do you please? What's the best way to address it? And then when you make that decision, you'll get backlash because you're not fixing someone else's issue.
Politics is a process that decides who gets what benefits out of life. It decides whose water can be collected. It determines what's going to happen. And the whole purpose of politics is to help maintain the wealth. Politics is a tool, an instrument that's used by the wealthy class, the economic class, to control and monitor and restrain or compliment or reward other people.
Far from giving us socioeconomic power, our reliance on politics without economics has created a political landscape where even the very black politicians we vote for refuse to stand up for or even speak on black issues.
With the black politician, because they're financed by white people, okay, they're not able to do the bidding of the black community. Michael Nutter, even if he wanted to do what was in the best interest of blacks, he couldn't, because he doesn't have a black power base. His power base is white. We don't have a lump sum of money, nor do we have an organized political action committee where if they attacked Mayor Nutter, we could go out and defend him in the newspapers and pay for advertising to defend him. You got to have a black power base to do the bidding of black people. We want black people to get into office on white money and then do black people's business. It's not going to happen.
And politics, as I said, is a process that decides who get what benefits. It's based on the premise of quid pro quo, something for something. One hand washes the other. If I put a person in a political office and vote for him, he's supposed to owe me. If you go into a public office, the first thing you must learn to do is dance with the person who brought you to the party. If black folk put you in an office and you come from a black district, your first obligation is to take care of those black people that put you in office.
When the last mayor, Fenty, who I was going to run against, and who got defeated, was saying that when they asked him, well, what do you think about African Americans losing opportunity in the city? He stopped the report, said, oh, hold it. When you start talking race, that's when you get into trouble. We got to just all be this equal. Well, we're not all equal. He's in a city, he was presiding over in a city where 45% of all black people in the city was living in poverty. That's a problem. You got to acknowledge that. But so I think the challenge again is our elected officials. Who are we electing now? And are we electing people who now see themselves as trying to prove to the overall establishment that they're going to treat everybody equally? Yeah, we treat everybody equally, but we got to create opportunities. Got to rebalance the scales. The scales have all this gold here and empty here. And so we need to make the scale start going here. So they hover like this. But that means you got to put more weight and more gold here to balance it out. And you can't do that with blindfolds on.
We don't need black officials. We don't need them. We do not need a black face in a high place. We need black political power. Chain our votes together. If you don't chain your votes together, they don't work for you. The only black vote that matters is an organized black vote. If you vote in your conscience and I'm voting my conscience and she's voting her conscience, at the end of the day, whoever wins doesn't have to be accountable to any of us because we were not organized before we voted. Politicians are not chosen by individuals. They're chosen by groups, and it's time for our group to take a stand.
In America, the result of white privilege has been black oppression, and the ultimate symbol of this is the American court system. Lynching, police brutality, and other threats to our lives from various forms of institutionalized racism made us scramble to politics for a remedy. Instead of giving us a panacea, things actually got worse. Black people widely supported President Bill Clinton after 12 years of Reaganomics and the war on drugs, which disproportionately targets blacks. But far from bringing us social justice, Bill Clinton went the opposite direction and spearheaded the most infamous and punitive mandatory minimum sentencing law in history.
3 strikes and you are out.
The notorious 3 Strikes Law. Barack Obama was even more heavily supported by blacks, receiving almost 100% of the black vote. And yet he has the distinction of being the U.S. president with the fewest commutations and pardons in modern history. Less than Bill Clinton, less than even George W. Bush. Perhaps the best example of the fallacy of believing that black numbers and votes will equal power is the city of Philadelphia, where some of the worst miscarriages of justice against black people have occurred while being presided over by black leaders.
Philadelphia is the only top 10 American city in terms of population and importance. Okay, because as you know, the Constitution was written here, Declaration of Independence, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they all lived here. Okay, it's the only top 10 city where the blacks equal or exceed the whites in terms of population, which is to say, politically and economically speaking, if there's anyone who doesn't have an excuse for still being where they are, it's us. In Philadelphia, the white power structure controls the masses of black people through a group of hand-picked black people. Mayor Nutter is one. Our first mayor, Wilson Goode, who actually dropped the bomb on MOVE, okay, he was one. John Street, you know, he was one. So we've had 3 black mayors. Nutter is the 3rd. None of them really done anything for us.
Mayor Wilson Goode and MOVE. 2 names linked in infamy. Wilson Goode was elected the first black mayor of Philadelphia. He replaced Frank Rizzo, a white supremacist who left office openly calling for whites to take up arms against the black citizens of the city. In 1985, Philadelphia police were involved in their second standoff with MOVE members in 7 years, and the newly elected